The courtroom buzzed with the familiar hum of anticipation, lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering in quiet tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering and professional. It was another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case, the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench as she glanced at the ERS before her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, the world around her tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson, her James. Her throat tightened, memories flooding in. Summer afternoons racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana, late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard, the promises they made as kids to always have each other's backs. But the man standing before her was not the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face marked with hardship, but his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as she tried to process the impossible. James looked up, his expression a mix of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, nearly unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, as the prosecutor began their opening statements. Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was James, and somehow, she had to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as her mind drifted to a time long before black robes and a gavel in hand. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana. Their town was divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of segregation. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while James's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. Eleanor remembered how they met, an accidental encounter at the edge of a creek, where she'd wandered too far from her backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She had offered to help, and that simple gesture turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "You ever think about leaving this place? Really getting out, going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" he had asked one night, lying on the grass beside her under the stars. She had laughed it off then, but James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened, despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. Then one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside now." She hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near James, and soon after, James's family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Hammond. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of James after she walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of minor arrests, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed of violent nature. But how much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. James had assaulted a store clerk during a robbery at a Baton Rouge convenience store. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant Margaret approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head.
"I'm fine."
Just a lot on my mind. But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she'd buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if James were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young, but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, a store clerk who had been working the night of the incident. He described seeing a man who fit James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Lisa's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no," the witness admitted. "No further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was James, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Eleanor studied it intently. Could this truly be James? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. James's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism. As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness, but how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to James, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. As she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth, but for the first time, She wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp.